March 14th, 1944. The rubble-strewn outskirts of Cassino, Italy. A chilling, damp wind carries the stench of spent gunpowder and decaying concrete. The sound of American voices, thin and strained, filtered through a small bullet-pocked factory window. Water! We need water! For 6 days, 23 men of the U.S. 34th Infantry Division had been pinned inside this skeletal husk of a building, surrounded by the finest troops the Wehrmacht had, the elite German Fallschirmjäger. Every escape attempt had been met with a devastating hail of MG-42 fire that sounded to the trapped soldiers like linen tearing. Inside the factory, Captain James Morrison, the unit's commander, was rationing the last canteen, his face pale with exhaustion and dust. His men were wounded, parched and demoralized. Outside, just 50 yards away, lay the German command post, a 3-story reinforced industrial office building. It was the nerve center of the German defense in this sector, coordinating the machine gun nests that held Morrison and his men in a cruel, agonizing siege. Artillery had been called in, tanks had tried to breach the perimeter. Every conventional method had failed. The German position was too strong, too well coordinated. The situation was declared hopeless. They were deemed, by military calculus, expendable. But 400 yards back, in a miserable, muddy foxhole behind the American lines, Sergeant William Bill Hartley refused to accept that arithmetic. Hartley, a lanky man from the West Virginia coal country, had grown up understanding confined spaces and desperate odds. Captain Morrison was a friend. Hartley had served alongside him since North Africa. He could hear the faint, desperate pleas over the radio, the static often punctuated by the mocking, distant shouts of the German paratroopers. "We can't just listen to them die, Lieutenant," Hartley muttered, wiping the condensation from the lens of his glasses. Lieutenant Kowalski, an engineering officer who had been tasked with assessing potential relief options, shook his head. "Sergeant, there's nothing left. Command said break contact. We pull back. We regroup." Hartley looked down at the mud, then across the desolate expanse of no man's land toward the imposing German command center. "Artillery won't touch him. Too thick, too deep. But fire is different." He had an idea so wild, so completely against every military manual that he kept it quiet for fear of being locked up. He had found his weapon 2 weeks prior, a heavy German-made hunting crossbow abandoned in a farmhouse. It was a relic, an instrument of the Middle Ages, not modern warfare. But in Hartley's mind, it was the key. He looked at the discarded motor oil cans and the piles of pine scrap used for campfires. He knew how fire worked in a chimney, how quickly oxygen could turn a flame into a furnace. He needed a way to deliver that furnace, silently, precisely, right into the enemy's soft center. He began tinkering.
Midday, March 14th, 1944. A makeshift workshop, a collapsed section of roof tarped over, behind the U.S. Fifth Army lines. Hartley worked with a focused intensity that bordered on madness. His only assistant was Lieutenant Kowalski, who was there more to supervise an unstable man than to aid a genius. Hartley had secured his base, the heavy German hunting crossbow. It was slow, cumbersome, and utterly silent, the opposite of a rifle. It was perfect. First, the bolts. He scavenged rags and soaked them liberally in motor oil, the thick black lubricant used for the division's trucks. This would be the fuel. Then the seal. He found chunks of pine resin from nearby trees, melting it down to create a sticky, waterproofing sheath that would ensure the oil-soaked bundle didn't wick away its charge. This was his main projectile, a silent, flying torch. The final, crucial step was the fuse. He knew the shot had to ignite on impact. He painstakingly chipped the phosphorus heads off dozens of kitchen matches, affixing them in a ring around the bolt's tip. They were secured with tape and tiny bits of wire. The friction of the bolt striking glass or wood, even brick, had to be enough to set off the match heads, which in turn would ignite the oily rags. It was an elementary device, informed by his years working with combustion in the deep, dangerous shafts of the West Virginia mines. He called them, simply, fire arrows. He demonstrated the weapon for Kowalski, firing a test bolt into a discarded wooden crate. The thwack of the bowstring was soft, muffled. The bolt hit the crate with a dry snap, the match heads flashed, and the rags burst into an instant, angry flame. "It works, Lieutenant," Hartley said, his voice flat. Kowalski stared at the burning crate, then back at the sergeant. "It's primitive, Hartley. It's against the Geneva Convention to intentionally incinerate personnel, and it's an unauthorized mission. If you're captured, they'll treat you as a spy, not a soldier." "They're shooting my friends, Hartley. Convention's out the window. Besides, the Germans are using flamethrowers on buildings with civilians in Naples. I'm hitting a command post." He loaded his final 6 bolts into a pouch, secured the crossbow across his back, and checked his knife. His plan was absurdly simple. Crawl, shoot the arrows into the windows of the German command post, and use the chaos of the ensuing fire to create a break in the machine gun coverage. Then, he would guide Morrison and the survivors out. The entire operation was predicated on 2 things: his aim and the pure, paralyzing shock of the Germans seeing their reinforced headquarters suddenly swallowed by fire.
11:45 p.m., March 14th, 1944. No Man's Land, Cassino. Sergeant Hartley went over the top of the trench. The night was moonless, which helped conceal his movement, but the lack of light meant the open ground was a maze of treacherous craters and razor-sharp debris. He moved not with the aggressive speed of an attacker, but with the painful, meticulous care of a hunter. He stayed low, inching forward on his belly, using the jagged shadows of ruined walls and burnt-out tanks as cover. The mud clung to his uniform, heavy and cold. He could hear the German voices clearly now, the occasional burst of laughter from the command post. They were warm, dry, and supremely confident in their fortified position. Hartley's breathing was shallow and ragged, his every muscle tensed against the sudden, inevitable burst of MG-42 fire that would end his mission. He located the primary machine gun nests, one high in a window to his left, another directly ahead, and charted his course between their interlocking fields of fire. The distance, which had seemed manageable in theory, stretched out into an eternity of 400 yards. Finally, after nearly 2 hours of crawling, he reached his final position, a cluster of shattered masonry just 35 yards from the German headquarters. He could see the building clearly, a squat, ominous structure. Light spilled faintly from a second-floor window, the probable location of the German officers. It was 1:48 a.m. Hartley slowly unslung the crossbow. The silence of the moment was deafening, broken only by the distant, rhythmic pounding of artillery on the main casino monastery complex,
further up the mountain. He carefully sighted the crossbow, aiming for the center of the lit window. This had to be an immediate hit. A missed shot would give his position away and grant the Germans enough time to locate and kill him before he could reload the medieval weapon. He held his breath. He squeezed the trigger. The fire arrow left the bow with a soft thwumph. There was no flash, no muzzle report. It was a stealth weapon, purely kinetic. It traversed the short distance in an instant. The bolt slammed through the pane of glass. The fragile match heads detonated on impact, sending an immediate burst of flame to the oil-soaked bundle. Within seconds, the window was an angry, expanding sheet of orange and black.
1:50 a.m., March 15th, 1944. German command post, Cassino. The effect of the first fire arrow was immediate and devastating. The oily rags and pine resin created a fierce, dense, localized conflagration. Inside the second-floor office, the flames were instantly consuming papers, wood furniture, and communications equipment. The heat, magnified by the confined space, was horrific. Shouts erupted from inside the building, high-pitched and panicked. The German paratroopers, veterans of countless battles and accustomed to the sounds of heavy combat, were completely unprepared for this silent, medieval ambush. Hartley worked with mechanical precision. Ignoring the sudden floodlight of noise and fire, he quickly reloaded the heavy crossbow. The movement was slow, deliberate, but practiced. He sighted on the next window adjacent to the first, targeting a different area to spread the fire and confusion. Thwump! The second bolt struck. A new burst of flames erupted. The Germans, realizing the attack was focused, began firing randomly out of the unbarricaded ground floor doors. But their fire was undirected, without a clear target. Their disciplined formation was dissolving into pure self-preservation. Hartley fired a third, fourth, and fifth bolt, aiming at different vulnerable spots on the building. The industrial office, the Germans' critical tactical hub, was now engulfed. The oil and resin created a smoke so thick and acrid it choked anyone inside. Within 3 minutes, the command post became a blazing funeral pyre. The real tactical success was achieved next door. The machine gun crews who had been pinning down Morrison's men saw the inferno. Their officers, their commanders, and their vital communications were being incinerated. Discipline cracked. Several gunners abandoned their positions to rush toward the burning building, either to attempt to rescue or to simply flee the intense heat and the paralyzing shock of the attack. This was the moment Hartley had gambled everything on. The interlocking fields of fire, the seamless web of bullets that had kept 23 Americans trapped, had suddenly been broken by fear and fire. Hartley fired his sixth and final fire arrow. He slung the now empty crossbow and for the first time in hours stood upright. He turned and sprinted toward the factory building, shouting in a voice hoarse with effort, "Morrison, move! Now!" 2:05 a.m., March 15th, 1944. The American factory stronghold. Inside the shattered factory, Captain Morrison and the 22 surviving men heard the shouts and, more importantly, smelled the smoke. The light spilling through the tiny windows had changed from the cold gray of moonlight to the wild, flickering orange of a massive fire. Morrison, dragging his weary men to alertness, recognized Hartley's voice. They knew what this meant, a fleeting, suicidal chance. "Hartley!" Morrison called out, his voice raw. We're coming!" Sergeant Hartley reached the factory wall, dodging stray rounds fired by confused German soldiers. The chaos was his shield. The fire at the command post was now a towering inferno, casting shifting, terrifying shadows across the battlefield. The heat was becoming unbearable, and the air was thick with the smell of burning wood, oil, and flesh. The German communications center was totally lost. 7 German officers, including their battalion commander, lay dead or mortally wounded inside, incinerated by the improvised weapon. Hartley directed the evacuation. He prioritized the wounded first, helping the 2 most severely injured men drag themselves through the narrow breaches in the factory wall. The healthy men followed, keeping low, their M1 Garands ready, though they were too exhausted and exposed to risk sustained combat. "Keep your heads down! Follow me! Stick to the shadows!" Hartley commanded, now acting as the sole lifeline for the group. He led them through the same treacherous path he had crawled along hours before, but this time under the high contrast light of the raging German command post. The noise was a terrifying mix of the roaring fire, collapsing debris, and the desperate shouts of the Germans who were now trying to fight the blaze instead of the Americans. By 2:47 a.m., Sergeant Hartley led Captain Morrison and 21 survivors, 2 had died from their wounds during the siege, back across the safety line and into the American trenches. The escape was complete. They arrived exhausted, covered in mud and soot, but alive, pulled from the brink of certain death by a man who had defied orders and used a weapon out of history's dustbin.
Later that morning, March 15, 1944, U.S. Fifth Army Headquarters, Italy. The aftermath of Hartley's mission was met with a bizarre mix of astonishment, celebration, and disciplinary concern. On one hand, 21 men had been saved, a German battalion commander was dead, and a critical communications center was destroyed, directly impacting the German defensive coordination around Cassino. On the other hand, Sergeant Hartley had committed several serious offenses: unauthorized deployment, use of a non-standard weapon, and potential breach of international convention regarding incendiary devices against non-military targets, though this was a command post. The story was immediately classified. The official account focused on a successful infantry infiltration utilizing high explosive charges to obscure the unconventional weapon. General Mark Clark himself was said to have been briefed on the incident. Military brass understood the power of the achievement but couldn't endorse the method. Sergeant Hartley was put forward for the Distinguished Service Cross, one of the highest military honors. However, due to the unsanctioned nature of the mission, the recommendation was downgraded. Instead, William Bill Hartley was awarded the Silver Star for gallantry in action. It was a compromise, recognition for his extraordinary courage without validating the breach of military protocol. After the war, Hartley returned home to Beckley, West Virginia, a hero known only to a small circle of men. He never spoke much of the fire arrows or the night at Cassino, trading his wartime ingenuity for the quiet, honest work of a carpenter. He passed away in 1983, but his relic of war, the heavy German crossbow, was preserved. Today, the fire arrow crossbow and its story stand as a powerful testament not to industrial might or overwhelming firepower, but to the desperate ingenuity of a single man who refused to abandon his comrades. It is the story of how scrap metal, defiance, and a simple knowledge of combustion succeeded where tons of high explosive artillery had utterly failed.
the silent weapon broke the line.